Sir.
Call Brendan Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to follow the member opposite, who seems to suggest that members on this side opposite represent some kind of urban elite. I'd like to challenge that notion. We actually represent a broad spectrum of New Zealanders, many of whom still believe that actually the state has a role beyond simply ensuring that the market thrives. The state, in respect of broadcasting, might have something more to do with ensuring we actually have some content that people might want to watch from time to time. I had the privilege over the weekend of being in Australia on a short break from the rigours of Christchurch, and I happened to also be there during the time when Julia Gillard, a very fine Labor Prime Minister, announced to her nation the carbon tax proposals, which will take Australia forward to 80% reductions in their climate change emissions by 2050, well ahead of the government opposite's target of simply 50% by 2050, a bold move by a Labor government. And I also, of course, had the pleasure of watching some of Australia's public service television, ABC 1, ABC 2, SBS 1, SBS 2, ABC 24-hour news.
Order. Now, interjections are fine. I'd actually like to hear what the member's saying, and I'll ask you to calm them down, otherwise I'll have to rule against you. Brendan Burns.
Thank you for that intervention, Mr. Speaker. I had the privilege of watching those 5 non-commercial state channels in Australia, and I will not for 1 minute suggest we should emulate Australia. We are not as wealthy a nation as Australia. We only have 1/5 of the population. But what we did have until this bill was a non-commercial channel which served the broader interests of New Zealand and the populace of New Zealand beyond simply what the commercial model delivers. And as it is, we are the only nation in the OECD, other than Mexico, which will now have no state television service with anything other than a commercial motive. And I think that is a very, very backward step. And I have to ask members opposite, what sort of media environment do we want as a nation to live in? Do we want to be a nation where we only have commercial channels with the commercial drivers? If you want an example of where that can lead to, you only need to look to the recent coverage of what's been happening with Rupert Murdoch's empire in Britain. The news of the world, paying police, scanning private phone calls, tapping the phone calls of dead children and soldiers who died in the service of this country, and frightening politicians on both sides of the House to live in subservience to Rupert Murdoch. That's the sort of media environment you get to when you make the dollar or the pound the king and the market drives, and there is nothing there to constrain them. And do not try and pretend to me that there's no connection to New Zealand on these issues. Who owns 40% of Sky in this country? Rupert Murdoch and his empire. And the minister says we have never had more choice. Who is providing the multiplicity of channels on the Murdoch-owned Sky network? Scott Murdoch himself, through his various connections into American providers and others. Rupert Murdoch provides much of the content that we see on New Zealand television at the moment. The idea is promulgated by the minister that we are simply consumers. I say absolutely not to that on behalf of New Zealanders. We are more than consumers. We are citizens of this nation, of this land. We need something more than what's the most popular. We need something more than what simply sells the most. We need more than something that simply rates the most. If you want an example of where that has led to in our recent times on our state-owned channel, you need to look no further than Paul Henry, who, encouraged by the TVNZ management, pushed the line of what was acceptable to public taste until finally even he crossed that line and paid the ultimate price. But I don't hold Paul Henry responsible for what happened to him. I hold the management of TVNZ responsible for it, and I hold the government responsible for it because they effectively encouraged TVNZ through this bill, which says all that TVNZ ever has to do now is make a profit and return it to the government. There is no other consideration in this bill at all. That is all that the government requires of TVNZ, of our state-owned broadcaster, is to simply make more cash, to return it to the government. It doesn't give a darn about what the content is. It doesn't give a darn about what sort of services provided. It is downgrading TVNZ. It is dumbing it down, and it is simply saying, don't worry about it. Just make sure you give us the maximum amount of cash, because that really is the only thing that matters to us as a government. On behalf of our nation, we require you, TVNZ, nothing more of you than to simply coin it in the marketplace. And if that means you go into programs with questionable taste and decency, then so be it. And you only need to look at TVNZ's putting to air of the program Hung fairly recently with a self-explanatory title, which the BSA has ruled on, which was, I understand, screened anywhere else in the world, certainly not on any state television, and even not on free-to-air television. Anywhere else in the world, I understand, it's screened on cable, which has some capacity for parents to put in a constraint upon who can watch it. Not so in this country, and that's the kind of direction this government wants TVNZ to go in. It doesn't give a damn about the content. It doesn't give a damn about the probity of the programs. It simply says, under this bill, go off and coin at TVNZ. That is your only requirement. And I think that's a very sad day for this country, when a government is prepared to say to a state-owned enterprise, which I think has a quite sacred duty to actually represent New Zealanders, to give them some sense of their identity, to give them some sense of their culture, and that's exactly what TVNZ was required to do under the Charter, which was at the heart of Labour's time in office, and which is absolutely thrown out by this bill and simply replaced by this profit motive. And I look to TVNZ 7, which has had, I think, a fantastic track record in innovative and cheap programming. It's certainly not been at the top end of the spectrum in terms of what the taxpayer's been getting for their dollar spent. It has been a very innovative program. Members opposite will have known that from appearing on the Backbenchers program. I have the privilege of being able to appear again tomorrow night on Backbenchers. It is not highbrow. It's not highbrow. It actually is good, innovative, low-cost programming which actually allows New Zealanders to have a little bit of fun with their politicians. That's the sort of thing which we should be encouraging, not putting forward a bill which says the only thing that matters is to put profits into the pockets of the government from TVNZ. What a shabby, shameless, short-sighted way for a government to view a proud history of TVNZ and its predecessors, to put it into a context where it's simply told, dumb it down, make it rate, make it sell, we don't care whatever you do with it. This is what a legacy for Jonathan Coleman to go out of this House as Minister of Broadcasting in the reshuffle that I'm sure is coming very shortly, and to say that his only contribution to the TVNZ, to broadcasting, has been the TVNZ bill and a Radio New Zealand bill, which 18 months after it was due to have been passed still languishes on the order paper. What a legacy for that minister to leave behind. Can he truly go out of office proudly saying, I did my best for New Zealand, I did my best for state broadcasting, I cut it, I simply put it on a footing which said profit is all that matters, that's the only thing. I drove it down. I saw Paul Henry's rise, I saw Paul Henry's fall. There'll be more of it to come under the sorts of prescriptions that this bill delivers, and it's a very sad day for New Zealand to see TVNZ reduced from a proud history with public service at its core and a requirement, yes, to make some money, to fund itself along the way, a mixed model which is simply no longer a mixed model. It's simply a model with the profit centre at the heart. Nothing other matters. What a sad, shameful, shabby piece of legislation.
Call Sue Kedgley.